What's going on, guys? My name is Tommy Dimsdale. I'm a regional director with the National Association for Gun Rights, and I want to welcome you to another History Hour production. And this week we're going to be focusing on the life or near-death experiences of George Washington. It's an absolute amazing story to really dive into Washington's life outside the Revolutionary War and see just how close he came to death on a multitude of different occasions. It's amazing to see the blessings that we have as a country with his survival, because if you've looked into George Washington's life, as I have, as much as I can, I've come to the conclusion that there is no way that we would have won the Revolutionary War had it not been for this man's grit, his determination, and his fighting spirit, and the, as he would call it, the divine hand of providence that protected him from death on so many occasions. Now, if you believe in God like I do, you'll come to the conclusion as well that, yeah, he was protected by God. There is no doubt in my mind about that. If you don't, and you believe in superheroes, well, he's probably the closest thing to a Superman that we've had in modern day history, or anything close, for sure. He could not be killed in battle, and I fervently, honestly believe that he couldn't have been killed in battle. By the way, we're getting a bunch of excerpts from this from my book, A Call to Arms, An Introduction to the Case for Christian Activism in Our Government. I want to give a special shout out and thanks to Pastor Greg Butler of Pauline for writing the foreword for this. This book is chock full of stories just like this, so if you enjoy today's episode and you want to learn more about history and a little bit about politics and everything else, this book was condensed down to just like 100 pages to respect your time of the reader, to where you can read this probably in a weekend very easily, get through it, but it is chock full. It is very dense with really cool stories, awesome information. I became enamored with some of the stories that we're going to talk about today, and a lot of the reasons that we're talking about these particular stories about George Washington and his near-death experiences is I want to convey to you just how blessed we are as a nation, as a people, because we get to experience something because of those moments in history and those close misses on Washington's life. Because of those moments, we get to experience something that very, very, very few people get to experience in this world, and that is an article such as freedom. And not only are these just great stories, but it gives us reason to do something with the blessings we have, to understand that we have been given something, and we cannot let that gift go in vain. We have to make these blessings count. So I do hope you enjoyed today's episode. Without much further ado, let's jump into the story of the Invincible George Washington. Throughout Washington's life, many of his associates and his friends would marvel at his obvious ability to cheat death on a multitude of occasions. Washington, by the age of 17, was already an accomplished surveyor, drawing maps and diagrams on the frontier. Living a life past one's teens was an accomplishment, but to also provide for oneself and brave the dangers of the frontier was even a more notable endeavor. In July 1752, the then 20-year-old Washington mourned the loss of his brother, James, and subsequently took responsibility of his position leading the Virginia militia. Not long after, the Lieutenant Governor of Virginia assigned Washington with a task to deliver an ultimatum to a French outpost on the outskirts of the American territories. So you see, France had just begun staking claims to lands on the border of English property and had to be reminded that their actions were not going unnoticed by the King of England. These actions eventually led to the French-Indian War, sometimes known as the 7 Years' War, in which Washington also repeatedly escaped bodily harm. Washington set out to endure a 500-mile trip of wilderness travel into what is now modern-day Pennsylvania. Upon delivering the letter, the leader of the French garrison responded with a stubborn reply that France had rights to the land that they were now occupying.
Oh, go away or I shall taunt you a second time.
The young militiaman, eager to return the letter back to Virginia, ignored all the warnings of dangerous winter travel and decided to embark on a return journey just 10 days before Christmas. Washington could hear the past warnings repeating from the harsh elements whispering through the pines, but after several days into the trip, it was now too late to heed them now. Washington and his fellow frontiersman guide, Christopher Gist, ran across a seemingly friendly native who promised to help show them the way to more hospitable territory. After some miles of traveling, the Indian guide offered to carry the trio's heavy muskets, and Gist untrustingly handed over the firearms, insistent on keeping a close eye on the guide. As the three men began walking into a bright, clear field, the natives struck off running about 15 paces before turning around aiming directly at Washington and fired. For a fraction of a second, as the musket shot pierced through the air, all of eternity held its breath as the fate of a future revolutionary experience hung perilously in the balance. The fate of the way of living for the entire world depended on where that musket ball landed. Should the future Revolutionary War general and president be struck down now, all hope would have been lost for the future colonists. The great idea of American self-governance would never be born. Miraculously, the Indian warrior missed by mere inches, his shot landing with a crack inside the trunk of a nearby tree. Gist and Washington both advanced on the traitor, beating him and removing him of all weapons. A bloodied Indian limped back into the forest, a wiser man, and back to his tribe, more empty-handed than he had been when he had left. The remainder of the trip proved equally perilous as water crossings nearly drowned the two of them. A makeshift raft proved alarmingly unreliable, and upon being splintered by enormous chunks of ice, it left the duo to swim to a midstream island. This left Washington sleep all night in ice-hardened clothing. The bitter night was so cold they woke up the next morning to see the river had completely frozen over, allowing passage. How hypothermia did not set in and freeze them both to this day is a mystery. The stories that permeated the press of Washington's return into higher military ranks, where he led men into battle numerous times at the young age of 23. Washington remarked on the exhilaration of battle, "I heard the bullets whistle, and believe me, there is something charming in the sound." Obviously, being close enough to hear musket shot whistle past shows just how mired in the battle Washington would sometimes be. Reports all throughout Washington's life from men he fought beside exclaimed the near recklessness the general exuded in the heat of battle. From centering himself in a flurry of French gunfire or commanding troops in the rain of British mortar fire, Washington's bravery in the face of danger was not only astonishing but miraculous. As tensions rose between the French and the British over the disagreements over frontier property rights, Washington decided to assist during the French-Indian War. His mother protested fervently his involvement in military affairs, and he responded, "The God to whom you commended me, madame, when I set out upon a more perilous errand, defended me from all harm, and I trust he will do so now. Do not you?" She eventually relented, saying, "With his blessing you can be a useful man in war as in peace, and without it you can expect nothing." With this, Washington set off to assist the British in navigating the wilds of the frontier, and before long the French-Indian War was being fought across the globe, but more importantly in Washington's own backyard. The young navigator was assigned to support General Edward Braddock in a mission to take Fort Duquesne along the Monongahela River. Washington had already been suffering from an awful bout of what colonists called the bloody flux, and had to make much of the trip in a wagon. As the 1,500 British regulars marched within a few miles of the French-occupied fort, Washington resolved to ride in the saddle again, strongly cautioning General Braddock away from using traditional British military methods of meeting their enemies on an open field. Washington knew of the dangers and tactics of the Indian populations west of the colonies, but Braddock resolved to keep his soldiers marching in traditional lines through the woods, ripe for the picking of any attempted ambush. As Englishmen, it was considered proper warfare to meet your opponents on the field, firing, reloading, and firing again in perfect formation. Braddock even vastly outnumbered his opponent by nearly 600 men. He was not prepared for the carnage that would ensue by ignoring Washington's warnings. The morning of July 9, 1755, shots rang out all through the trees as Edward Braddock moved his troops in closer. Lines of redcoats tumbled to the ground in pain, agony, and blood as the smoke clouds plumed from French muskets in the woods. As the shots kept raining down upon his men, seemingly from nowhere, the horses panicked, sensing the fear and confusion of the British regulars. The natives weaved in and out of the trees as silent spirits or thick mists would, never firing in volleys, but with a constant randomness that kept the British from being able to recompose their forces. The men wasted precious ammunition into the trunks of trees, firing where their attackers had been mere moments before. Many panicked regulars began sprinting for the back of their regiments and anywhere they could find cover from the hail of musket shot. Washington, seeing the pandemonium, began spurring his horse from the rear of the battalion, desperately attempting to rout the obvious chaos that had gripped his men. He arrived at the front line, shouting orders and attempting to bring his men into some kind of formation. As he drew his cutlass and began circling the troops, a thud pierced through the chaos of battle and rippled through his horse, sending her crashing down into the dirt and blood. Luckily, the landing did not pin Washington or break his legs upon impact, leaving him to continue fighting on the ground. He was eventually able to retrieve another horse from a fallen officer. As hours passed in the battle, bodies began littering the forest floor. The violence of the scenario made it increasingly hard for this steed to walk without trampling the bodies of the fallen. The smell of death and gunpowder mixed rife in the air, making his horse anxious as he rode back and forth rallying his troops. As British regulars began to form behind Washington, the Indian chiefs gave orders to take down any and all mounted officers. Make sure he dies! As the armies exchanged gunfire and escalated the fight further, Washington noticed several tugs at his jacket, but he kept spurring his horse into enemy fire, slashing any Frenchman or Indian that would dare get close enough. Gritting his teeth, he felt once again the thud of a musket ball tearing into his horse and her legs collapsing underneath her. Another horse shot from under him. Washington sprang back up and continued fighting. Washington was soon made aware of the now dying Braddock and had to carry out Braddock's orders as general. Edward Braddock had been wounded in the arm with a musket ball lying hotly lodged into his lung. "We will know better how to deal with them another time," he told Washington before sending him out back to battle to carry out Braddock's last orders. The evening brought an end to the battle, with 977 British regulars being killed or wounded from a full force that started out as nearly 1,500. Too many of the British had returned fire on their own men amid the confusion, adding to the list of the dead. Every single officer had been shot from their saddle except for the one, George Washington. Later that night at the campfire, as Washington removed his officer's cloak to warm himself by the fire, a private militiaman directed his attention back to his jacket. "What's that, sir?" Washington, astonished at the fortitude, surveyed the 4 musket shot holes in his jacket, shots that had missed his chest and torso by mere inches. "There's another one in your hat, sir," the militiaman pointed out, and sure enough, upon the inspection of his hat, a musket ball had gone right through. Washington shook his head in disbelief as he ran his finger through the hole, trying to comprehend the divine intervention that had saved his life that day. He later wrote back to his family, "By the miraculous care of Providence, I have been protected against all human probability or expectation. For I had 4 bullets in my coat and 2 horses shot under me, yet escaped unhurt, although death was leveling my companions on every side of me." Years later, during Washington's encampment at Valley Forge, an Indian chief named Red Hawk requested to meet with the commander. The troops cautiously brought the Indian chief into Washington's tent, watching his every move. The chief cleared his throat and began. "I have traveled a long and weary path, that I might see the young warrior of the great battle. It was on that day, when the white man's blood mixed with the streams of our forest, when I first beheld you. I called to my young men and said, 'Quick! Let your aim be certain, he dies.' Our rifles were leveled, rifles which, but for you, knew not how to miss. 'Twas all in vain. A power far mightier than we shielded you. Seeing you were under the special guardianship of the Great Spirit, we immediately ceased to fire at you. I have come to pay homage to the man who is the particular favorite of heaven, and who can never die in battle. I am old, and soon shall be gathered to the great council fire of my fathers, in the land of shades. But ere I go, there is something bids me speak in the voice of prophecy. Listen, the Great Spirit protects that man and guides his destinies. He will become the chief of nations, and a people yet unborn will hail him as the founder of a mighty empire." On September 8, 1779, the Revolutionary War was raging. General Washington and another field operations officer departed their camp to survey the surrounding areas for reconnaissance. The 2 officers made their way to a clearing, coming within sight of 4 British sharpshooters stationed in the trees. Major Patrick Ferguson was the leader of the group and was a renowned marksman. Ferguson was famous for his invention of the Ferguson rifles that were introduced to the British snipers and hailed for their deadly accuracy that rivaled any other gun of the day. Ferguson and his men stiffened at the chance to take down the 2 Continental officers, but upon sighting the men, Ferguson felt an odd injustice in shooting a man unprepared. He noted that the officer carried himself quite well upon his steed, and several moments went by as Washington's body was firmly inside Ferguson's crosshairs, but the major kept arguing with himself on the nobility of shooting such a man. Ferguson blinked, and the general rode back out of sight. He later declared, "I could have lodged half a dozen balls in him before he was out of my reach, but it was not pleasant to fire at the back of an unoffending individual who was acquitting himself of his duty, so I let him live. I am sorry that I did not know at the time who it was." Amazing story. So next we'll fast forward to the siege of Yorktown in 1781. Washington and his troops had surrounded Lord Cornwallis in Yorktown, slowly starving the army held inside. This story in itself is fascinating, but we'll save that for a later episode. Today we're focusing on one particular instance that occurred while Washington and his men were slowly making their way closer to the fort's walls. A full assault on a well-defended city like that would have been suicide. So instead of doing that, the Continental Army made their way closer with the slow and arduous task of digging trenches, shielding them from the cannons of the British that had many outposts outside the fort. Now, digging these trenches would allow them to take on each post one at a time, and before long they began making decent progress. But on September 29th, 1781, Washington's men got close enough to start inviting British cannon fire from the fort itself. Being almost out of range, the casualties were minimal, at least for now. The general resolved to get right down into the mud and dirt with his men, also lending a hand in the digging process. Every day, his men drew closer and closer to the city, taking out fortifications as they worked along, and many men marveled at the sheer bravery or ignorance of Washington, standing time and time again in the line of fire as cannonade erupted around him. While surveying the trenches, a cannonball landed very near to Washington. A deafening thunder of light and noise as it erupted among his officers. His ally, Rochambeau, had been knocked from his seat and remained blinded and deaf from the explosions for several seconds after. When his senses finally came back, he realized he had rolled into one of the nearby trenches, dirt and rocks still raining down against his back and shoulders. As the smoke cleared away, one can only guess at what he saw. That's right. Staring through his spyglass as if no sound, light, or explosion had ever occurred was General Washington. Washington looked down to his feet where a chaplain's hat lay. Chaplain Evans scrambled up from the ground, astonished at his good fortune. Washington knelt down, retrieved the hat, noted the singe marks around the outside brim, and handed it back to the chaplain. "Mr. Evans," he smiled, "you had better take that home to show your wife and children." To not see the intervention of God's hand in Washington's life would be a disregard of factual history. Washington, a godly man who cheated death that day under the scope of Ferguson's rifle, remained resilient under hypothermia in the wilds of Pennsylvania, the only remaining officer left standing on the battlefield beside the Monongahela River, had 2 horses shot out from underneath him, 4 bullet holes through his uniform, another through his hat, and miraculously survived a near direct hit from British cannons at Yorktown, would go on to lead the Continental Army to victory in the Revolutionary War, forever changing the course of world history, religious freedoms, and free markets for decades and centuries to come. So, I leave you with this challenge. Now that you've heard of all these miraculous blessings we've received through the protection of George Washington, what are you going to do with those blessings? How are you going to make those blessings count? If you're not sure yet, and you believe as I do that the Second Amendment protects all the rest, you can start off with a $30 membership to the National Association for Gun Rights and keep up with all you need to know and do to help protect our gun rights. Beyond that, become a student of history, economics, and politics. Become a subject matter expert on whatever you're passionate about and begin making changes starting in your own community. Local nonprofit organizations like NAGR and some of our state affiliates are some of the best ways to get involved in the movement. So, in closing, I'll leave you with that challenge. Go forth and make a difference, like so many others have in the past, and even though they've even had to pay a far greater price than we do today. Let's keep making those differences so our children and grandchildren won't have to carry the same heavy burdens our forefathers did. Once again, my name is Tommy Dimsdale with the National Association for Gun Rights. Y'all have a blessed day.